Welcome to the Martinus Cosmology podcast. This is a new podcast dedicated to talks and reflections on life, seen from the perspective of the Danish writer Martinus and his cosmology. My name is Pernilla Rosell. I'm from Stockholm, Sweden, and I'm very happy to present our first two podcast guests, Mary McGovern from Scotland.
Hello.
And Colleen Turoczy from England.
Hello.
I'm so happy that you could join us for this introduction podcast. And before we start, since this is our first podcast, we should actually give some brief information about Martinus. Martinus was a spiritual writer who lived in Denmark from 1890 to 1981. He went through a strong spiritual experience at the age of 30, and, as he describes it, this led to a great expansion of his consciousness. After this experience, Martinus had access to a spiritual reality. He calls it the eternal world laws, invisible causes, basic energies and basic principles behind the physical world. Martinus has written several thousand pages about this, and he has drawn 100 symbols, and he also gave a great number of lectures. This is an introduction, which means that we will not be able to cover this, not even the most basic thoughts, actually. I think that you will mention some of those aspects today, but we will also talk more about the components of his world picture in our next podcast episodes. If you're interested in learning more, though, we strongly recommend that you visit the homepage of the Martinus Institute, www.martinus.dk, where you will find many texts by Martinus himself available online. You will find a very good 9-minute film about Martinus and his works and a lot of other information. And we also recommend that you visit our own homepage, www.martinuscosmologypodcast.com, where you can watch a short film with Mary McGovern, our guest today, where she will give us a brief introduction to Martinus and to the Martinus Center in Denmark. Because this is where we are right now. We are sitting here in a summer cottage in the Martinus Center in Klint, about 60 miles from Copenhagen. And many people come here in the summer in order to study Martinus cosmology or his cosmic analyses. He's not very well known, though, not even within Scandinavia, we have to admit, and there seem to be very few people outside of Scandinavia who have heard about Martinus and his works. But you have, Mary and Colleen, and I know that both of you have come here now for many years. So if you could just tell us a little about yourself. When did you encounter Martinus and his cosmology for the first time? Would you like to start, Mary?
Yes, I encountered Martinus in 1974, the beginning of 1974, January. It happened in a very strange way because I was studying music at the Guildhall School of Music in London, and I fainted at the piano, collapsed with a great noise on the keys, and my piano teacher got hold of the nurse, and she sent me home to Scotland for the weekend. She said I needed a rest. I was used to fainting, so for me it wasn't a problem, but she thought I should have a rest. Anyway, I got to Glasgow, where I come from, in Scotland, and when I got there, I thought what I need is some more lessons in the Alexander technique, which we'd had at the music conservatory. So I rang this Alexander teacher who had a very strange name and met him, and it turned out he was Danish. And one of the first things he asked me was, "What do you think about reincarnation?" And I said it sounded like a very good idea. And of course that has nothing to do with the Alexander technique, but he began to tell me a lot about Martinus's ideas, and without mentioning his name at the beginning, but later on I said, "Where did you get all these ideas from? You haven't thought all of this up yourself." And he had to admit, well, he had read some books, and they were by this Danish writer called Martinus. So he lent me a little book called The Road to Initiation, in an old translation by Anna Ørnsholt, who lived in India and worked for Nehru, President Nehru. And she had translated some of Martinus's works into English. So I read this little book 3 times over a weekend and came back with the book on Monday with pages of written questions, and this Danish Alexander teacher was very impressed. And he happened to be going to Copenhagen to visit his mother, so he called in at the Martinus Institute and bought the rest of the books in English. At that time there were only 3 small books, and the first volume of the Eternal World Picture, the so-called Symbol Book, and the first volume of Livets Bog, the Book of Life. And I read them all as fast as I could, and then I ran out of things to read, so I had to learn Danish.
So you had to start translating, and you have been translating Martinus's work ever since, haven't you?
Yeah.
And you can tell us more about this later on. What about you, Colleen? When did you encounter Martinus's cosmology for the first time?
In about 1984, I live in Devon in England, and I live in Torquay, but I used to go to Totnes for Alexander technique lessons. And Mary McGovern was there working at the Alexander Training School. But she was giving lessons to my husband at the time. I just got married, I think, that year or the year before. And I was having Alexander lessons with a different teacher. And my husband would come home and talk to me about his lessons, and I would talk about mine. And then one day he came home and he said, one day we were going to be planet beings. We would evolve into being a planet. And his Alexander teacher, Mary, had told him this. And I was just instantly fascinated by this idea and had to know more. And I kept sending him back with questions, and he'd come back and try to answer them. And in the end, Mary said to him, why don't you tell Colleen to come and speak to me directly and I can answer her questions? And so I started going to a weekly study group with Mary in Totnes for about a year before she left England to come over to Denmark to translate. And for me, it was just an instant recognition. I think I'd grown up as a Catholic, and I'd sort of grown out of being a Catholic, but although I loved Jesus and I loved a lot of what I'd learned as a child, I also questioned so much. And all of the questions that were bothering me seemed to be answered by Martinus's big world picture, particularly reincarnation. That was the one thing, because before that, if I'd heard about reincarnation, it was in a very airy-fairy way. You were going to come back as the Queen of Sheba, or you'd been somebody famous, and it all sounded ridiculous. But then I read Martinus's, or heard through Mary Martinus's explanation of reincarnation, and it just made perfect sense to me.
So you found some important answers right away, and it seems as if you haven't lost interest later on either. You've continued studying this for many years now.
Yeah, I quickly read as much as I could within the first few years, and then the symbols are also fascinating, because you can, by studying the symbols, even the things that aren't translated into English yet, you still get the whole world picture through the symbols. So I found that interesting as well, and I'm still studying that. And also, you change yourself, so you come back 5 years later to what you read when you were younger, and each time you read it, you've grown and evolved, and you have a new insight. So it's a lifetime's study, at least one lifetime.
And you, Mary, as you told us, you even left Britain for Copenhagen and Denmark. And, well, you're still here, aren't you?
Yes, because in 1984, the Martinus Center opened a so-called winter school where you could study Martinus full-time. I planned to come in 84, but a colleague of mine in Totnes in Devon got very ill, so I put off coming for a year, and I moved here in 1985 to study Martinus full-time at the winter school at the Martinus Center. And that was fantastic. We spent 2 years reading Martinus's complete works. We read the whole of Livets Bog, we read the Book of Life, we read all the symbol books, we practiced explaining the symbols for one another. We read all his small books, we read all his articles, we listened to all his recorded lectures. And it was a fantastic immersion in this world picture. And it was also an immersion in Nordic languages, because I had taught myself Danish, but coming here I realized that nearly all the teachers were speaking Swedish. And the people I was studying with were speaking Danish, Swedish, Norwegian. And there were Icelanders who have their special form of Danish, and there was me. For a short time there was another man here from Manchester, but it was a great mix of Nordic languages, but and fantastic, intense period of studying Martinus.
Right, and since we're talking about it, if you read about Martinus and his life, for example, on the homepage of the Martinus Institute, you will know that Martinus himself led a very quiet life. He absolutely did not want to get famous. He didn't want us to focus on his person. The only thing that was important to him was his work and his cosmic analysis. But perhaps you could tell us just a little about who he was, and that you actually met him as well when you came here for the first time.
Yes, because I came here in the summer in 1978 when Martinus was still alive. I came to the English week. It was 1 week at that time. Rather special week. It started with me being bitten by a snake, so I got rather ill. But I was so determined not to miss anything, so with a very yellow face and a very, very swollen foot, I staggered around going to all the lectures and study groups. And then I was invited to have tea with Martinus, and in a way I didn't want to, because I was really kind of allergic to the idea of worshipping a guru, and I came here a bit skeptical. I didn't want to be sort of sit at the feet of a guru. I wanted to think for myself, and Martinus says that in his works, but I thought, I really want to see that this is true. And I realized when I was in Klint that it is true. You don't have to believe anything that Martinus says. He wants you to investigate it yourself and see if it fits with your experience of life. Anyway, they said, you can't say no to Martinus. He's invited you for tea. So anyway, I went there, and of course I didn't speak Danish at that time. So there was an elderly lady called Inger Sørensen who did her best to interpret for me. And Martinus took his main symbol, the symbol of the eternal world picture, the living being two, it's also called, the eternal Godhead and the eternal sons of God. He took this down from the wall, and he explained it for 3 hours through this interpreter, which was so generous, really, really generous. And he gesticulated and was energetic and funny and laughing, and in the middle he stopped and laughed and laughed and laughed. And I said, I completely forget that she doesn't understand a word I'm saying. Anyway, Inger Sørensen did a fantastic job interpreting for me, and I asked him what the highest fire was at the end, because it was mentioned in the English books but it wasn't explained, and he laughed his head off, and he said to Inger Sørensen, "You'll explain that to her in the morning, won't you?" That has to do with sexuality. So I think he saw a young girl there and thought, well, maybe that was too big a subject for the first meeting. I don't know. But I got the impression of a very, very warm, generous man who really got a lot of energy from people's questions. Otherwise, he was rather old when I met him, so he could easily sort of fall asleep in his chair if he wasn't talking about things that really interested him. So if you asked him questions about his cosmology, he was full of energy, and the chair was creaking. He was so alive. Yeah. So that was the first time I met him, and we went out to Annebjerg, the glass collection, and had tea and could talk further there. Could ask him more questions, and we were together in Copenhagen. Went out to tea in another place in the north of Copenhagen. Walked around a lake, and Martinus talked a lot at that time about nuclear waste giving the Earth constipation. That was the bit I had translated. I remember kept talking about nuclear waste at that time. But I did manage to speak to him once in Danish. He rang me up on my birthday, and we had a brief. I was arranging a Martinus lecture in London, and we had a brief talk about that. So I did actually manage to communicate with him directly before he died. So that was interesting.
Oh, that's very interesting. To me, at least, I think it's very interesting just to listen to those personal memories. This fact that Martinus himself did not want to be regarded as a guru or as an important person in that sense. Was that important to you as well, Colleen?
Yeah. When I first came here, it was about 1985 or 6, I can't remember exactly, and he had already died by then, so it was never an issue for me. I think when I first found out about him, it was the year after he died. So that was never an issue for me. I didn't have that worry. But I know that it's very important to me because people always assume when I talk about coming to the Martinus Center that it's some kind of sect, and I have to keep explaining that it's not something that you can belong to. Yeah, so that was very important to me, yes. That I'm my own authority in everything, whether it's health or, in any subject.
Your own independent thinking.
Yes.
Do you remember what it was like when you first came here?
I camped. We came by motorbike all the way across from England, so it was quite an exhausting journey. And I remember that I was sort of feeling quite shaky from being on the back, and I was riding pillion on this motorbike for days to get here. So I felt like I was shaking, and I arrived, and the very first thing that was happening within about 10 minutes of arriving was that Ola Thurkelson was giving a lecture. We went into the lecture theatre, and it was obviously being interpreted in English, so I had to get there. Oh no, it must have been an English lecture actually, because I remember sitting in the very front row, right next to him, because those were the only 2 seats left because the lecture theatre was so full. And I remember being just amazed by his energy and enthusiasm and just loving that first lecture. I remember just loving it here, really, the being by the sea, because I'm from Torquay, so I've always loved to be by the sea and to swim. So I just had a feeling of coming home. Even when we drove into Denmark, drove across the bridge, and I looked at the little flowers, the little blue flowers beside the road, looked familiar. So I felt at home straight away in Denmark. It was my first time in Denmark as well.
That's a beautiful way of describing it. Like a spiritual home, so to speak. And I think that many people can actually recognize that. They come from different parts of the world and they don't always feel at home at work or in their private lives. And then they meet people who they never met before, at least not in this life. And then they just feel, this is home.
Yeah, I think that's why I love coming here, because I've been coming for so many years, and I've come since I've been divorced with my children. I've got 3 children. They've all been here at different stages in their lifetime. So, yeah, but for me, I feel when I'm in England, I don't have anybody to really talk to about these ideas. And when I'm here, I just feel that I'm with like-minded people. So I feel at home. I feel like I'm with family. Even people I haven't met before, like you say, from people turn up who I've never met before, and yet within a few days they feel like old friends.
But I have been in Torquay, where Colleen lives a few times, and given some lectures about Martinus. But one could say the interest there is rather limited. I give lectures to the Theosophical Society there. But you're still on your own there. Yeah. So.
Yes, and as you already mentioned, you, Mary, you actually decided to move to Copenhagen or to the Martinus Center Klint because you felt so inspired by this world picture. That's quite a big step, actually.
Yes. I was so frustrated by the fact that I had read everything there was in English, and there were these big white books, Liebesbog, the Book of Life, that just weren't translated, and no one was doing it. And there was no prospect of anybody doing it because they didn't have anybody. So I thought, well, there's nothing else to do. I have to teach myself Danish. And I went back to London and found that Linguaphone Danish courses happened to be half price for a few weeks when I got back. They were otherwise rather expensive. So I bought one immediately. And of course, no one was teaching Danish where I lived, so I had to teach myself. And gradually I began to read some Martinus articles in Danish. And if you see my old copies, they're all full of English vocabulary. I used to spend an awful lot of time on London transport, going backwards and forwards from where I lived to the music conservatory or to concerts or whatever I was doing. So I used to always travel with a little Martinus book or a Martinus article and a Danish-English dictionary. So I must say I was rather well disciplined. I studied Danish from 7 until 8 in the mornings, and before the day started. And slowly but surely I began to be able to read Martinus in Danish. And then got a shock when I came here and found that most people were teaching in Swedish. But at least I could read the books. But I quickly learned to understand the Swedes as well. So
Yes, those two languages are related.
yeah.
But I imagine that when you first came here, when you met Martinus and when you came here from Britain, I imagine that they found it quite fantastic because you would represent an international audience in a way.
Well, they actually made quite a lot of fuss over me when I came. I was only 24, and of course, I'm a native English speaker, even though I'm a Scot. I have a Scottish accent. But I think the people here were so unused to foreigners coming, so they made an extraordinary fuss over me, which was a bit weird for me. But, there were... Before that, in the 70s, I had heard Mogens Müller, who was one of Martinus's assistants, one of the lecturers from here. He had given 2 lectures in London, and I had heard him there and bombarded him with questions, so I think he got rather tired of them. He also had terrible, terrible backache when he gave those lectures. He was standing on 2 crutches. So I had so many questions. And when I came here, Mogens Müller was teaching in English and several others, and people were just happy to hear all my questions. I had so many pent-up questions, and enormous perspectives opened up. When you can only read a little part of this world picture, there's so much more to know, and it was fantastic to come here and have it all explained and get all the symbols explained, because at that time there was only the first symbol book available, so there were all the other symbols to be explained and so on. So it was an absolute revelation. And I have a Catholic background like Colleen. I came from Catholicism too. And I remember when I was 17 asking a priest and a nun how, they claimed that Christ dying on the cross had saved mankind, and his resurrection had saved mankind. And I said, but is mankind saved? There was a war in Vietnam, and there was starvation in Biafra, and there were Catholic families with 14, 15 children and tired mothers and so on. And I said, is the world saved? And how could the crucifixion and resurrection do that? And I was thrown out of the class for blasphemy just for asking that. And I thought, but I really wanted to know the answer. Mm-hmm. And when I read Martinus's little book, Easter, that was an absolute revelation. And then I realized, this man really understands Christ. Martinus understands Christ. Well. Yeah. Actually, it was terribly expensive. It was for sale in Watkins Bookshop in London, and I was on a student grant. So I went there every day from Monday to Friday and read a few pages. And they only had 1 copy, and I was so afraid it would be gone if I left it there over the weekend. So on the Friday, I actually bought it, and I thought, if I don't eat for a week, I have to read the end of this book. So, but it was an absolute revelation. I thought, at last, someone who understands the whole mystery of Christ and his mission. It all suddenly makes sense, and it had a lot to do with reincarnation and how life could be fair, and what the resurrection and the crucifixion and the resurrection really meant. So
it's quite tempting to start talking about Martinus's actual thoughts.
Yeah.
Because, as you say, there are many interesting answers to be found.
Yes.
But if you could just move forward a little to 2016, today, in a way, you were really pioneers.
Yeah.
And I imagine that there must have been very few English-speaking people here at the time.
There still are very few.
Yeah, what's it like today?
Every year that I come, there are very few English people still. So the interest in England is still very little. Obviously, there are lots of English speakers here. So there are people from America as well now.
And Holland and Morocco.
Yes, yeah. And that's what's wonderful, that everything is interpreted in all those different languages. So the lectures, even if they're not in English, are interpreted into English and Dutch and German and Spanish and sometimes Esperanto.
Yeah, sometimes Russian.
Sometimes Russian, oh.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a lovely feeling of internationalism. Mm-hmm. And even for me, one of the best things about being here is this feeling of cooperation, how everybody helps each other. The centre is run so harmoniously, and everybody's so helpful and friendly. And I remember my teenage children, when they hadn't been for a few years, and we came when they were about, 12 and 14, my daughters, who are used to being in the English school system, which is quite tough sometimes. And they got here and they said for the first couple of days, "Why is everybody here so fake?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "Everybody smiles at you all the time and everybody's very friendly." And they felt that was people putting on a fake front. And then after a few days, they realised that people were genuinely open and friendly and kind and helpful. And it seems like there are no problems here. Any little thing, if somebody is hurt or isn't well, or anything seems to get solved very easily by this spirit of cooperation. When I come, I help in the kitchen, and there's a wonderful feeling there. Everybody helps. There's wonderful vegetarian food, which is important for me. Yes, all the food is mostly vegan, and they cope with people who have food allergies in an amazing way, and it's mostly all organic food, so you do feel very well and full of energy when you're here. And for some reason I always sleep very well here. It's very wonderful atmosphere. So it's a good holiday. Even though I'm working, I still feel very refreshed when I go home.
Well, I think that sounds absolutely wonderful. And you, Mary, you work as a translator. We already know that. But you also work as a teacher.
Yes.
Of course. You teach Martinus's cosmology in English and in Danish. And you've done so for many years as well.
Yeah.
So you've met many international guests. And what do they like about being here? What do they usually tell you?
Well, I just talked to one of the Americans who's come here for the 5th time. And she said that Martinus's world picture harmonizes very much with her view of life, and she said it helps her with her relationships, with her marriage.
I think for her it was a revelation, a sort of coming together of all the things that she'd been interested in all her life.
Yeah,
and that she suddenly saw one of the symbols somewhere, and it was something that she'd pictured herself over the years. Something very similar. So
yeah, I mean, some people do spontaneously have spiritual experiences, but they don't understand them. So there's one of our guests who's like that, and when she discovered Martinus, then she made sense of her spiritual experience. Suddenly there was someone who could explain what it was she had seen, and we have experienced that a few times here. It's not that common, but sometimes. Otherwise, I think people find that this world picture is so vast that you can come here year after year after year and get more out of it. And of course, we're working on the translations all the time. And if we look at the English group this week, people are reading the same book in English and Dutch and French, but we're talking about it in English. That's a typical English group. And of course, we're translating more and more. And the more we translate, the more foreigners will come here. I envisage, and the easier it is to have that kind of international mix.
Yes, you've already mentioned the sea, the beautiful countryside here in Denmark. What can people do here apart from studying, of course? What activities can you take part in if you come here for a summer course?
Well, I mean, there are the morning lectures which are interpreted, and then there are study groups. Then there's lunch, and then there's some free time off where you can read if you're in a study group which requires reading, or you could have time to go swimming or go for a walk along the beach, or go for a walk to the forest that's nearby, or you can take the bus into Nykøbing, the nearest town. It's 10 minutes away, and you can have a look at the shops. And Colleen's children like to go in and buy ice cream and this kind of thing. Go down to the harbour, have a look around, be a tourist. And most people like to come back for 4 o'clock to hear the symbols being explained in English. Then there's dinner, and in the evening there's either a lecture in English or there's some entertainment. And we have a lot of voluntary artists and musicians here, so people give concerts, or they show their art, or show films, or that kind of thing that they themselves have made. So there's actually quite a lot of cultural stimulus here. There is music, there is art, as entertainment, as well as all this study. But I think the greatest entertainment here is the countryside, because it's so beautiful. It's by the water, it's very peaceful, it's in a big bay on the Kattegat. you can walk in either direction, and it's absolutely beautiful.
And do you also think, Colleen, that the opportunity of just getting to know other people with similar interests, with the same questions, is that important, an important reason for coming here?
Yeah, definitely. For me, it's just they just feel like friends, like coming back each year and meeting old friends. Even if they're new people, they still feel like old friends.
Exactly.
And the teenagers come and they don't particularly study or go to lectures, but they are also meeting like-minded teenagers, so they really seem to have a lovely time. They go to the beach at night and, they're not particularly studying Martinus, but they do seem to absorb something. They go home feeling much happier and more relaxed.
But this week we've had a group of 4 young Americans in the English group between the ages of 19 and 21. So some of them do study, but some of them just like the atmosphere here. So
they can just be typical young people. They can party and can go into Nukabing to the disco at night. It's not all seriousness.
No, they have a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yes, and like you said, just enjoying the atmosphere and the culture in a way, because this is also a place where people really try to develop a more humane culture, isn't it? We'll talk more about that, I think, in our next podcast as well. But you mentioned, Colleen, that you work in the kitchen.
Yeah.
And actually almost all the people who are working here at the Martinus Center in Klint are volunteers. The whole organization, the whole place is based on voluntary work.
Yes.
Do you think that that's important, that you can come here as a volunteer as well as taking part in the course?
Yeah, for me it was really important that, because it's not just that I'm giving to it, but that I'm getting back, because I'm a single mum with 3 kids. I couldn't have afforded to come and stay in Denmark. Whenever I tell people in England I'm going to Denmark on my holidays, they say, oh, it's very expensive in Denmark, isn't it? But luckily, because I'm helping here and the teenagers are helping as well, it's not as expensive as staying in a hotel and having to pay for all the meals, because that's part of the co-workers or the volunteers. We get some accommodation, we get some of the lectures and some of the food. So I get something back from it as well, which I couldn't have afforded.
Yes, I can certainly understand that. So again, that sounds absolutely wonderful. But time flies, and I think that it's time that we wound this episode up. Fortunately, you will come back. Mary and Colleen, you will come back to the Martinus Cosmology podcast and talk more about the actual contents of Martinus's world picture. You will talk about some of the topics that you mentioned, like, for example, reincarnation in our next episode. And I'm very much looking forward to that. Perhaps we have time for one last question, though. If we could just look into the future, Mary, do you have any visions, any plans for the future of this place, the Martinus Center Klint? What would you like to happen here in the future?
Oh, my hope and plan is to finish the translation of the whole of Livets Bog, the Book of Life. At the moment we have volumes 1, 2 and 4 in English. We have translated 3 and 5, but we're currently checking them and improving the language and so on. And we hope that they can come out fairly soon, although I won't promise a deadline. And then there's volume 6 and 7 to translate it. And when we've done that, we'll have the whole of the Livets Bog, the Book of Life. So that's my first temporary goal. But otherwise, I envisage that we have the 6 weeks of summer courses in the Scandinavian languages here at the Martinus Center in Klint. Of those 6 weeks, the last 2 are in English, but I envisage in years to come that all 6 weeks will also be in English. What else do I envisage? Yeah, I envisage for myself becoming a better person and applying the world picture to my daily life more and more, and letting it influence me in a good way.
Do you share those visions, Colleen?
Yeah, I think it's important that studying Martinus is just the theory, but the really difficult thing is applying it and changing who you are and the way you behave and your relationships. So that's the hard bit through the rest of the year. This is the holiday.
Yes. But then we all need a holiday, don't we?
Yeah.
I think this sounds extremely inspiring, at least to me. And then I would just like to thank you so much, Mary and Colleen, for joining us today in this first episode of the Martinus Cosmology podcast. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, for now, we'll say goodbye to you from our summer holiday cottage at the Martinus Center in Klint. Thank you so much for listening.